It was one of those mornings where the heat seemed to cling to everything, making the air thick and heavy. Officer Frank Peterson, a man who had built his reputation on discipline and authority, was patrolling his usual route. As he rounded the corner, his eyes narrowed at the sight of a car parked in a clearly marked no parking zone. Without hesitation, he strode towards the vehicle, his mind already set on issuing a ticket. The driver, a young man dressed in a simple white shirt and jeans, looked up just as Frank approached, his face a mix of worry and apology. Frank, however, was in no mood for excuses. "Step out of the car," Frank demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The young man, who introduced himself as Adam, complied, his hands slightly trembling as he did so. "I'm sorry, officer," Adam began, trying to explain. "I just stopped for a moment to take a call. It was urgent." Frank barely let him finish before cutting him off. "Rules are rules," he snapped, his voice harsh and unforgiving. To Frank, this was just another case of someone thinking they were above the law, and he wasn't about to let that slide. Adam's explanation fell on deaf ears. As Frank began writing the ticket, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about maintaining order, something he believed was his personal duty. Adam stood there, his expression now one of quiet resignation. He didn't argue or plead, which only served to irritate Frank further. To him, the young man's calm demeanor was a sign of disrespect, a challenge to his authority. Frank thrust the ticket into Adam's hand, a final act of dominance. "Next time, follow the rules," he said coldly. Adam looked at the ticket, his face unreadable, and nodded. "Thank you, officer," he said softly, his voice devoid of the anger or frustration Frank had expected. There was something in Adam's tone that made Frank pause, but he quickly brushed it off. As Adam got back into his car and drove away, Frank watched him go, feeling a strange, unsettling sensation in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't guilt. Frank rarely felt that, but something about the encounter gnawed at him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as he returned to his patrol. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Frank couldn't shake the image of Adam's calm acceptance. It lingered in his mind like an unresolved puzzle, and by the time he clocked out, it had begun to irritate him. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to sense when they were hiding something, and yet Adam had remained an enigma. Frank told himself it didn't matter. He had done his job, and that was all that counted. But deep down, a part of him knew this wasn't the end of it. That night, as Frank sat alone in his small apartment, he found himself replaying the encounter over and over. The way Adam had looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with something else, something Frank couldn't quite name. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He tried to push it out of his mind, focusing instead on the game blaring from the TV, but it was no use. The image of Adam's face, calm and unreadable, stayed with him, haunting his thoughts. The next morning, Frank woke up feeling strangely restless. He was usually eager to get back to work, to impose order and make sure the rules were followed. But today was different. He couldn't help but wonder if he had been too harsh, too quick to judge. It was a fleeting thought, one he quickly buried under layers of justifications and years of ingrained behavior. After all, he was the authority. He knew what was best. Yet, as he donned his uniform, the unease from the previous day crept back in, nagging at the edges of his conscience. As Frank prepared to leave for his shift, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His reflection stared back, the stern, unyielding face of a man who had seen too much and cared too little. For a brief moment, he wondered if Adam had seen through that facade, if he had recognized the cracks in the armor Frank wore so tightly. The thought made him uncomfortable, and he quickly turned away. He was Frank Peterson, a man who didn't bend or break, not for anyone. And yet, as he stepped out into the morning sun, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The following morning, Frank arrived at the station with the usual sense of purpose, ready to dive into another day of routine police work. The buzz of anticipation in the air was palpable as his fellow officers gathered in small groups, murmuring about the arrival of the new captain. Frank, still wrestling with the unease from his encounter with Adam, tried to push the thoughts aside. He focused instead on the chatter around him, piecing together bits of information about their new leader. The consensus was clear. This captain was young, ambitious, and had a reputation for being tough but fair. Frank didn't think much of it until the moment of truth arrived. The door to the captain's office swung open, and in walked the last person Frank expected to see. Adam Collins, the same young man Frank had humiliated just the day before, stood before the assembled officers, his presence commanding but calm. Frank's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Adam, now in full uniform, with the captain's insignia on his shoulder, scanned the room with a level gaze, seemingly unfazed by the previous day's incident. Frank's mouth went dry as he realized the precariousness of his situation. This wasn't just some random citizen he had crossed paths with. This was his new boss. Adam introduced himself with a composed authority that belied his youth, speaking with a quiet confidence that immediately earned the respect of the room. He outlined his vision for the department, emphasizing teamwork, accountability, and above all, respect for the community they served. Frank could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him, each one a reminder of his own failings. Adam didn't look at him directly, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that every word was meant for him. The tension in the room was thick, though none of the other officers seemed to notice the subtle undercurrent between the two men. As the meeting progressed, Frank's discomfort grew. He couldn't help but steal glances at Adam, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint that Adam might bring up their encounter. But Adam remained professional, focused on the task at hand, giving no indication that he held any grudge. Frank's mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions: relief that Adam hadn't mentioned the incident, and anxiety over what this meant for his future. The more Adam spoke, the more Frank realized just how out of his depth he might be. He had expected to intimidate Adam, not to be standing on the edge of a potential disaster. When the meeting finally ended, Frank felt like he had been holding his breath the entire time. The other officers dispersed, chatting animatedly about the new captain and the changes he might bring. Frank, however, was in no mood to join the conversation. He slipped away quietly, retreating to the solitude of his desk. His mind replayed every second of the encounter from the day before, each detail now magnified in the harsh light of Adam's new authority. How had he misjudged the situation so badly? Frank's confidence, once as solid as the badge on his chest, began to crumble. Over the next few hours, Frank tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but the reality was impossible to ignore. Every time Adam passed by, Frank felt a jolt of nervous energy, his usual composure unraveling bit by bit. He wondered how long Adam would keep up this charade, pretending not to remember, acting as though Frank was just another officer under his command. The uncertainty gnawed at him, turning routine tasks into grueling exercises in focus. Frank, who had always prided himself on his ability to remain cool under pressure, found himself struggling to maintain even a semblance of control. By the time lunch rolled around, Frank was a bundle of nerves. He sat alone in the break room, picking at his food, his mind racing with thoughts of what Adam might do. The young captain had the power to make his life a living hell, and Frank knew it. He was acutely aware of the eyes on him, the unspoken curiosity of his colleagues who sensed something was amiss but didn't dare to ask. Frank's usual bravado was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was left with the gnawing fear that at any moment, Adam would make his move. The waiting was almost worse than the act itself. As the day dragged on, Frank's anxiety reached a fever pitch. Every interaction with Adam was fraught with tension, each word and gesture scrutinized for hidden meaning. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that this was all some elaborate game, that Adam was toying with him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was torture, knowing that his fate was no longer in his own hands, that the balance of power had shifted so drastically in just 24 hours. Frank was used to being in control, but now he was at the mercy of a man he had wronged, and the realization was suffocating. The following day, the tension in the station was almost tangible, though it remained unspoken among the officers. Frank arrived early, hoping to avoid Adam's scrutinizing gaze, but fate had other plans. As the morning briefing began, Adam took his place at the head of the room, his expression unreadable. Frank felt his heart rate spike, the dread pooling in his stomach as he waited for the other shoe to drop. The room fell silent as Adam cleared his throat, preparing to address his team. Frank braced himself, expecting the worst, but what came next was far more disconcerting. Adam began by speaking about the core values he believed should guide their work: integrity, respect, and accountability. His voice was steady, calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that Frank couldn't ignore. As Adam continued, he subtly shifted the focus to the dangers of abusing power, of letting authority go to one's head. He didn't mention names, didn't point fingers, but the implication was clear to Frank. It was like a knife twisting in his gut, the guilt from their first encounter surfacing with a vengeance. Frank sat rigid in his chair, every muscle tensed as Adam's words sank in. Adam's tone was measured, almost too controlled, as if he were carefully navigating a minefield. He spoke of the importance of treating every citizen with dignity, regardless of the circumstances. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Frank could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, though they remained oblivious to the underlying tension. Adam's gaze never lingered on Frank for too long, but each time it did, it felt like a spotlight shining directly on him. Frank's hands clenched into fists under the table, his pulse pounding in his ears as Adam's speech continued. What unnerved Frank the most was the restraint in Adam's demeanor. He had expected anger, confrontation, perhaps even public humiliation, but Adam's approach was far more insidious. By not addressing the incident directly, Adam left Frank in a perpetual state of uncertainty. Frank's mind raced with questions. Was this Adam's way of exacting revenge? Was he planning something more subtle, more drawn out? The ambiguity was maddening, leaving Frank trapped in a cycle of guilt and paranoia. He found himself flinching at every slight change in Adam's tone, every shift in his expression. As the meeting drew to a close, Frank felt as though he had run a marathon. The tension in his body had taken its toll, leaving him drained and jittery. Adam dismissed the officers, but Frank remained rooted to his chair, too shell-shocked to move. The other officers filtered out of the room, their conversations light and easy, completely unaware of the storm raging inside Frank's mind. Adam gathered his notes, moving with the same calm efficiency that had marked his entire speech. Frank's eyes followed him, searching for any sign of what was to come next, but Adam gave nothing away. Before leaving the room, Adam paused, his eyes meeting Frank's for the briefest of moments. There was no anger in his gaze, no accusation, but rather a look of quiet resolve. It was as if Adam were silently telling him that this wasn't over, that Frank had yet to face the true consequences of his actions. The exchange was brief, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but it left Frank reeling. As Adam exited the room, Frank was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of the unspoken threat pressing down on him. He knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be prepared. Over the next few hours, Frank's anxiety festered. the uncertainty gnawing at him like a relentless itch. Every time Adam passed by, Frank's breath hitched, expecting some kind of confrontation, but it never came. Adam remained professional, even courteous, which only served to heighten Frank's paranoia. The longer this went on, the more convinced Frank became that Adam was biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The waiting was a torment in itself, each passing minute stretching Frank's nerves to their breaking point. He found himself jumping at shadows, every sound and movement setting him on edge. By the end of the day, Frank was a wreck. The psychological toll of Adam's subtle tactics had left him exhausted and frayed. As he packed up to leave, his hands trembled slightly, a stark contrast to the steady, unflappable demeanor he usually maintained. The realization that Adam had managed to unravel him so completely without ever raising his voice or directly addressing the issue was a bitter pill to swallow. Frank had always prided himself on his strength, his ability to command respect through sheer force of will, but now he felt like a puppet on a string, with Adam holding all the power. The days following Adam's subtle revelation left Frank in a state of constant unrest. The guilt that had started as a nagging discomfort had now grown into a heavy burden, pressing down on him with relentless force. Every time he walked into the station, the walls seemed to close in around him, the familiar surroundings now a constant reminder of his mistake. Frank had always seen himself as a man of principle, someone who upheld the law with unwavering conviction. But now, that self-image was crumbling, and in its place, a harsh reality was beginning to take shape. The man he saw in the mirror was no longer the embodiment of authority, but someone who had lost his way. Each interaction with Adam only served to deepen Frank's sense of guilt. Adam remained professional, his demeanor calm and collected, but there was an undeniable shift in their dynamic. Frank found himself second-guessing every decision, every word that left his mouth. The confidence he once wore like armor was now riddled with doubt. He couldn't shake the feeling that Adam was watching him, not with anger or malice, but with something far more unsettling: disappointment. It was as if Adam had expected better from him, and that silent judgment was more painful than any reprimand could have been. At night, Frank's thoughts became a prison of self-reproach. The memory of that fateful encounter replayed in his mind, over and over, each detail etched into his consciousness with cruel precision. He saw the look on Adam's face as he handed him the ticket, the way he had accepted it without protest, without even a hint of resentment. Frank had taken that calmness for submission, but now he understood it for what it was: dignity. The realization cut deep, leaving Frank to grapple with the stark contrast between his own actions and the integrity Adam had shown in that moment. The guilt was no longer something he could ignore. It had become a part of him, a constant reminder of his failure. During his shifts, Frank noticed a change in how he approached his work. Where once he had been quick to assert his authority, now he hesitated, questioning the fairness of his actions. He found himself giving people the benefit of the doubt, listening more and judging less. But this shift wasn't born out of newfound empathy. It was driven by guilt, by the desperate need to atone for the wrong he had done. Frank couldn't escape the feeling that he was on borrowed time, that sooner or later, Adam would decide that his chance at redemption had passed. The weight of that possibility was almost unbearable. The other officers began to notice the change in Frank, though they didn't understand its cause. They saw a man who had once been a pillar of strength now struggling with his own demons, and it unsettled them. Frank had always been the one to set the standard, to enforce the rules without flinching, but now he was faltering. The whispers started, quiet at first, but growing louder as the days went on. Frank heard them, but he didn't have the energy to confront them. How could he defend himself when he knew the truth? He had betrayed the very values he claimed to uphold, and no amount of excuses could erase that fact. In the midst of his internal turmoil, Frank found himself thinking back to the early days of his career. He had joined the force with a clear sense of purpose, driven by the desire to protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, that purpose had been overshadowed by the need to assert control, to wield power. The badge had become a symbol of authority rather than responsibility, and Frank had lost sight of what truly mattered. As these realizations dawned on him, Frank felt a profound sense of loss, as if he were mourning the man he had once been, the ideals he had abandoned in his pursuit of order. Adam, for his part, seemed to sense the shift in Frank, though he never addressed it directly. Instead, he continued to lead by example, his actions a quiet rebuke to Frank's past behavior. Every time Adam handled a difficult situation with grace and fairness, it was a reminder of what Frank had failed to do. The respect Frank had once commanded through fear and intimidation was now being earned by Adam through compassion and understanding. And with each passing day, Frank's guilt grew heavier, as he realized that he had not only wronged Adam but had also betrayed the very principles that had once guided him. The more Frank tried to make amends, the more he felt the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be. The weight of his guilt was suffocating, leaving him struggling to breathe under its crushing force. But even in his darkest moments, there was a small part of him that clung to the hope of redemption. He didn't know if it was possible, if he could ever truly atone for his actions, but he knew he had to try. The alternative, living with the knowledge that he had failed not just Adam, but himself, was too painful to bear. And so, Frank resolved to change, to become the man he had once aspired to be, even if it meant starting from the bottom and rebuilding himself from the ground up. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Frank and Adam grew more palpable, though it remained unspoken. Frank's attempts to amend his past actions were met with polite indifference from Adam, who seemed to be watching, waiting to see if Frank's change was genuine or simply a temporary response to guilt. The unspoken conflict between them simmered beneath the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. Frank, once a man who thrived on control, now found himself grappling with uncertainty. His every move was measured, his words chosen with care, as he tried to navigate the minefield that his relationship with Adam had become. The situation reached a boiling point when Adam assigned Frank to lead an undercover operation, a high-stakes mission that required absolute trust and cooperation between the two men. Frank knew this was a test, one that could either solidify his redemption or confirm his downfall. The mission was complex, fraught with risks, and demanded a level of coordination that left no room for error. As Frank prepared, the weight of the responsibility pressed down on him. He couldn't shake the fear that Adam might still harbor resentment, that he might be setting Frank up for failure. Yet, there was no turning back. Frank had to prove himself, not just to Adam, but to himself. The first few days of the operation were tense but uneventful. Frank and Adam worked together with a professionalism that belied the undercurrents of their personal conflict. They communicated efficiently, their interactions marked by a careful, almost mechanical precision. Frank was acutely aware of the scrutiny he was under, every decision he made potentially the one that could make or break the mission. The pressure was immense, and with each passing day, the stakes seemed to rise. Frank's anxiety mounted, his fear of failure compounded by the knowledge that this mission was his chance at redemption, a chance he couldn't afford to squander. Then, as if the tension weren't already unbearable, the mission took an unexpected turn. A critical piece of intelligence was compromised, throwing the entire operation into chaos. Frank and Adam were forced into a situation where their survival depended on absolute trust in one another, a trust that had yet to be fully established. Frank's heart pounded as they navigated the dangerous terrain, every instinct screaming at him to be cautious, to double-check every move. But there was no time for hesitation. In the heat of the moment, Frank found himself relying on Adam's judgment, following his lead without question. It was a leap of faith, one that left Frank feeling exposed and vulnerable. As the operation grew more perilous, Frank's respect for Adam deepened. He saw firsthand the qualities that made Adam an effective leader: his calm under pressure, his strategic mind, and his unwavering commitment to the mission's success. But with that respect came a growing sense of inadequacy. Frank couldn't help but compare himself to Adam, the younger man who seemed to embody all the virtues Frank had lost over the years. The guilt that had haunted him now transformed into something more complex, a mix of admiration and self-doubt that left Frank questioning his own worth. How could he ever measure up to a man like Adam? Despite the mounting danger, Frank and Adam managed to work together seamlessly, their actions synchronized in a way that surprised even them. It was as if, in the face of external threats, their personal conflict faded into the background, replaced by a mutual drive to survive and succeed. For brief moments, Frank felt a sense of camaraderie with Adam, a connection forged in the crucible of shared adversity. But those moments were fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the underlying tension that still simmered between them. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how well they worked together, the unresolved conflict would eventually come to a head. As the operation neared its climax, Frank's nerves were stretched to their limits. The mission had brought him to the brink of his endurance, both physically and mentally. Every decision felt like a tightrope walk, with failure on either side. Frank knew that one misstep could spell disaster, not just for the mission, but for his future. The pressure was almost too much to bear, but he pushed through, driven by the need to prove himself. To Frank, this mission had become more than just a job. It was a crucible, a test of his ability to redeem himself and reclaim the respect he had lost. In the final hours of the operation, the tension reached its peak. Frank and Adam found themselves in a life-or-death situation, their survival hinging on their ability to trust one another completely. It was a moment of truth, one that would define the outcome of the mission and their relationship. Frank, driven by a desperate need to atone, made a split-second decision that put his life on the line to save Adam. The act was both a calculated risk and an instinctive response to the guilt that had plagued him for so long. As the dust settled, Frank realized that, in that moment, he had finally found the courage to act selflessly, to put someone else's safety above his own. The operation had reached its most critical point, the tension between success and catastrophe balanced on a knife's edge. Frank and Adam were deep in enemy territory, their every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. The situation had become increasingly volatile, with each passing second heightening the risk of discovery. Frank could feel the pressure building, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a vice. He knew that this was the moment everything had been leading up to, the moment where he would either prove himself or confirm his deepest fears. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. As they moved through the shadows, Frank's senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body tuned to the danger surrounding them. Adam was ahead, his movements calculated and precise, guiding them through the maze of threats with an almost uncanny intuition. Frank followed closely, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could go wrong. Despite the fear gnawing at him, there was a strange clarity in Frank's thoughts, a focus born from the realization that this could be his last chance to make things right. He had to trust Adam, to trust himself, and to trust that all the guilt and self-doubt would fuel, rather than hinder, his actions. Then, the unthinkable happened. In a split second, the operation took a disastrous turn. A hidden enemy force, one they had not anticipated, closed in on their position. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire and shouts, the chaos erupting around them like a storm. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he took cover, his mind scrambling to find a way out of the nightmare unfolding before him. But amid the panic, he saw something that froze him in place. Adam was trapped, pinned down by enemy fire with no clear path to safety. Frank knew in that instant that he had to act, that this was the moment where everything would be decided. Without a second thought, Frank sprang into action. His body moved on instinct, years of training and experience guiding his every move. He ignored the bullets whizzing past, the shouts and screams that filled the air, focusing solely on getting to Adam. Time seemed to slow as he raced across the open ground, his mind eerily calm despite the chaos. Frank knew the risks, knew that he was putting his life on the line, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was saving Adam, proving that he was more than his past mistakes, that he could be the man he once aspired to be. Frank reached Adam just as the enemy's fire intensified. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, Frank pulled Adam to safety, shielding him with his own body as they dove for cover. The pain from a grazing shot barely registered as Frank focused on returning fire, providing the cover they needed to escape. Adam, though shaken, quickly regained his composure and joined Frank in the fight. Together, they managed to push back the enemy, their coordinated efforts a testament to the trust that had been forged in the crucible of battle. Frank could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a surge of determination that pushed him beyond his limits. As the last of the enemy forces were neutralized, a tense silence fell over the battlefield. Frank's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked at Adam, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. They had survived, but more than that, Frank had finally faced his demons head-on. He had risked everything to save Adam, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of a genuine desire to do what was right. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Adam, still catching his breath, turned to Frank, his expression one of both gratitude and understanding. "I knew you had it in you," Adam said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. There was no need for further explanation, no need to rehash the past. In that moment, both men understood that something fundamental had changed between them. Frank had earned Adam's respect, not through words or apologies, but through actions that spoke louder than any justification ever could. The conflict that had simmered between them for so long had finally reached its resolution, not in a climactic confrontation, but in an act of selflessness that redefined their relationship. As they made their way back to safety, Frank felt a profound sense of relief, the burden of guilt that had weighed him down for so long beginning to lift. He had faced his worst fears and come out on the other side, not unscathed, but stronger for the experience. Frank knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, that redemption was not a destination but a journey. But he also knew that he had taken the first, most crucial step. He had proven to himself and to Adam that he was capable of change, that he could be the man he had always wanted to be, a man of integrity, courage, and honor. As they reached the relative safety of their base, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving Frank with a deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. But there was also a sense of fulfillment, a feeling that he had finally made peace with the past. Adam clapped him on the shoulder, a silent gesture of camaraderie that spoke volumes. Frank looked at Adam and nodded, the unspoken understanding between them now solidified. They had both been tested, and in the end, it was their trust in each other that had carried them through. Frank knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning he welcomed with open arms. Returning to the station after the harrowing operation, Frank felt like a different man. The familiar walls that once seemed to close in on him now felt less oppressive, as if the weight he had been carrying had finally started to lift. The other officers greeted him with a mix of curiosity and respect, though none dared to ask about what had transpired. Frank's reputation had always been one of stern authority, but there was something new in the way his colleagues looked at him now, a recognition that went beyond rank and experience. They had heard about what he had done, about the risks he had taken to save Adam, and it had changed the way they saw him. Adam, too, had changed in the eyes of the officers. His leadership during the operation had solidified his place as a capable and respected captain, but it was his relationship with Frank that intrigued them the most. The tension that had once crackled between the two men was gone, replaced by a mutual respect that was palpable in every interaction. Frank no longer avoided Adam's gaze, nor did he feel the need to prove himself at every turn. Instead, there was a quiet understanding between them, a bond forged not through words, but through actions that spoke of trust and redemption. The station buzzed with the unspoken acknowledgement of this shift. In private, Adam sought out Frank, wanting to address the unspoken changes between them. They met in Adam's office, the room filled with the faint hum of the city outside, a stark contrast to the silence within. Adam looked at Frank, his expression serious but not unkind. "You saved my life out there," Adam began, his voice steady. "But more than that, you showed me the kind of man you really are." There was no judgment in his tone, only sincerity. Frank, who had spent so long dreading this conversation, felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. "I was just doing my job," he replied, but they both knew it was more than that. Adam nodded, acknowledging Frank's humility. "I want you to know that I never doubted your ability," Adam continued, his eyes meeting Frank's with a level of honesty that left no room for misunderstanding. "But I needed to see that you could rise above your past actions, that you could be the leader I knew you were capable of being." Frank listened, the words resonating deeply. For so long, he had been haunted by the fear that Adam would never forgive him, that he would be forever defined by his mistakes. But now, hearing these words, Frank felt something inside him begin to heal. Adam's respect was not given lightly, and Frank knew he had earned it. The conversation shifted from past actions to future possibilities. Adam, recognizing the change in Frank, offered him a new role within the department, a position that would allow Frank to mentor younger officers, to pass on the lessons he had learned through his own experiences. It was an opportunity for Frank to redefine his legacy, to ensure that the mistakes he had made were not repeated by others. Frank was taken aback by the offer, his mind racing as he considered the implications. It was a chance to make a real difference, to use his position not just for enforcement, but for guidance and growth. And it was a sign of Adam's belief in him, a belief that Frank had feared was lost. Accepting the role, Frank felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The bitterness and anger that had once fueled him were replaced by a determination to do better, to be better. As he stepped into his new responsibilities, he found that the respect he had earned from his colleagues wasn't just about what he had done during the operation, but about how he carried himself afterward. Frank had always believed that respect was commanded through authority, but now he understood that true respect was earned through integrity, through the willingness to acknowledge one's flaws and work to overcome them. This was the new foundation on which he would build his career. The relationship between Frank and Adam continued to evolve, grounded now in mutual respect and shared experiences. They worked closely, their partnership becoming one of the cornerstones of the department's success. Where once there had been tension and unspoken conflict, there was now a fluidity in their collaboration, a sense of ease that allowed them to tackle the challenges of their work with confidence. Frank no longer feared Adam's judgment. Instead, he valued his insight, knowing that it came from a place of genuine concern and a desire to see the department thrive. Together, they set a new standard for leadership, one that prioritized not just results, but the well-being of those under their command. Frank's transformation did not go unnoticed by the younger officers. They looked up to him, not just because of his rank, but because of the example he set. He was no longer just the enforcer of rules. He had become a mentor, someone they could turn to for advice and support. Frank found that he enjoyed this new role, the satisfaction that came from guiding others through the challenges he had once faced alone. It was a far cry from the man he had been at the start of his career, and as he reflected on his journey, Frank realized that he had finally found his place, not just as an officer, but as a leader, a mentor, and a man of integrity. As time passed, the bond between Frank and Adam became a source of strength for both men. They had weathered the storm of conflict and emerged on the other side with a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. The respect they shared was hard-earned, forged in the fires of adversity, and it became the foundation on which they built not just their professional relationship, but a genuine friendship. Frank knew that he owed much of his transformation to Adam's guidance, but he also recognized that he had done the hard work of change himself. In the end, it was this realization that allowed him to finally let go of the guilt that had once weighed him down and embrace the man he had become. As the months passed, Frank found himself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought him to this point. The man he had been before meeting Adam felt like a distant memory, someone he could barely recognize. Frank had always prided himself on his strength, on his ability to command respect through sheer force of will. But the events of the past year had taught him a lesson that no amount of experience or authority could have imparted. True strength came not from domination, but from humility. It was a hard-won lesson, one that had cost him his pride, but had given him something far more valuable in return. In the quiet moments, when the station was still and the city outside seemed to hold its breath, Frank would think back to that fateful encounter on the street, the moment that had set everything in motion. He had been so sure of himself then, so convinced that his way was the only way. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, Frank could see how blind he had been, how his arrogance had nearly cost him everything. The guilt that had once weighed so heavily on him had been replaced by a deep sense of gratitude for Adam's patience, for the second chance he had been given, and for the opportunity to grow into the man he was meant to be. Frank's transformation did not happen overnight, and it was far from easy. There were still moments when the old habits, the old ways of thinking, would try to resurface. But each time, Frank would remind himself of the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, and the consequences of those mistakes. It was a constant process of self-reflection and self-correction, one that required vigilance and honesty. But Frank was committed to it because he knew that the alternative, slipping back into the man he had once been, was unacceptable. He had come too far, learned too much, to ever go back. The respect Frank had earned from his colleagues was not just for his actions in the field, but for the way he had handled himself afterward. He had shown humility in the face of his mistakes, a willingness to learn and to change that was rare in someone of his experience. This humility had made him a better leader, a better mentor, and a better man. Frank had always believed that authority was about being strong, about never showing weakness. But now he understood that true authority came from the ability to admit when you were wrong, to ask for help, and to learn from those around you. It was a lesson that had transformed not just his career, but his entire life. As Frank continued to mentor the younger officers, he made a point of sharing these lessons with them. He wanted them to understand that the badge they wore was not just a symbol of power, but a responsibility, one that required humility, empathy, and a commitment to doing what was right, even when it was difficult. Frank knew that his own journey was far from over, that he would continue to face challenges and temptations. But he also knew that he had the tools to overcome them, the support of his colleagues, and the guidance of his mentor-turned-friend, Adam. Together, they were building a department that valued not just results, but integrity and respect. Frank's relationship with Adam had evolved into a genuine friendship, one built on mutual respect and shared experiences. They had both learned from each other, grown from their interactions, and become better men for it. Adam had shown Frank the power of humility, the importance of listening and learning, and the strength that came from admitting your mistakes. And in turn, Frank had shown Adam that people could change, that even those who seemed beyond redemption could find their way back to the right path. It was a friendship that neither of them had expected, but one that they both cherished deeply. In the end, Frank knew that the most important lesson he had learned was one of humility. It was a lesson that had come at a great cost, but one that had given him a new sense of purpose and direction. He was no longer just a man enforcing the law. He was a man living by it, embodying the values of justice, integrity, and respect that he had once taken for granted. Frank had found peace, not in the absence of challenges, but in his ability to face them with humility and grace. And as he looked to the future, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. Not because he was invincible, but because he was human, and he had learned to embrace that humanity fully. The story of Frank and Adam became something of a legend within the department, a tale of redemption and the power of humility. New officers would hear about it during their training, a reminder that no one was beyond saving, that everyone had the potential to change. Frank took pride in this, not as a badge of honor, but as a testament to the journey he had undertaken. He had gone from being a man who ruled through fear to a man who led through respect and understanding. And that, Frank knew, was the greatest victory of all. As Frank's story comes to a close, we're reminded that true strength lies in humility and the willingness to learn from our mistakes. If you've been moved by this journey of redemption, don't miss out on more stories that inspire and challenge us to be better. Subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and make sure to like this video if it resonated with you. And don't forget, your support means the world to us. If you'd like to help us bring more stories like this to life, consider contributing via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment. Your thoughts and reflections are important to us, so drop a comment below and let us know what you took away from Frank's journey. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.